Throughout history, there have been few periods as brutal and bloody as the Tudor era. It may have lasted just over a century, but it saw the reigns of ruthless kings and queens who sentenced many people to death and even turned on their own friends and wives. Henry VIII had 6 wives, 2 of whom lost their heads inside the Tower of London, and Bloody Mary, his daughter, burnt many people at the stake across the country. But some of the most prominent and powerful Tudor figures had their coffins and remains dug up after their death, some of these with more sinister intentions than others. In this video, we will look at the story of those important Tudor men and women, some close to royalty and the monarchy, and how their coffins were opened and their remains disturbed in some cases centuries after their death.
One of the most horrific executions of the Tudor period saw Henry VIII's Lord Chancellor, Sir Thomas More, a very pious and religious man, go to his execution upon the scaffold of Tower Hill. He was a well-respected man who served the king loyally, and More was a man of principle who could not support Henry VIII's changes to the church, and he also could not support Anne Boleyn as the Queen of England. More's execution on Tower Hill was performed by an axeman who efficiently took his head clean off in one swift blow. However, this was not the end of the story, as his head was then placed on a pike high above London Bridge. Then his body was laid to rest within the walls of the Tower of London. However, his head was located inside of somewhere completely different, and the true story of this is shocking and remarkable. Sir Thomas More refused to take the oath in which he recognised Henry VIII's second wife, Anne Boleyn, as Queen, and also the Tudor King as the supreme head of the Church of England. He was even forced to resign from his role as the Lord Chancellor on the 16th of May 1532. However, he stayed inside of Henry VIII's court as an advisor. However, his enemies then dug their claws in. People became vocal about his refusal to support the changes, and because of this he would fall from grace spectacularly. He was even accused of working with a nun who predicted the death of Henry VIII, which was said to have been treason, and in the April of 1534, Sir Thomas More was forced to meet with the King's Privy Council to discuss the oath of succession and supremacy. He was ordered to accept the changes and swear his support as so many had, and he did make some concessions saying Anne Boleyn could have been proclaimed the Queen. However, he did not accept the validity of Henry VIII and Anne's marriage, and he said this was not lawful in the eyes of God. He continually refused, and to get More to come around, Henry VIII had him sent to the Tower of London. It's believed as a threat more than anything, but Sir Thomas More was put up in comfortable lodgings inside of the tower, but he was willing to die for his beliefs, and he was brought to trial on the 1st of July 1535. He was called in front of a court which was made up of Anne Boleyn's family members, including her father, and More, being incredibly intelligent, managed to wrap up the judges in his arguments, and he refused to answer questions. But the prosecution's key witness was Richard Rich, a man who is regarded to have been one of the most barbaric of the Tudor period, and Rich claimed that, in his presence, Thomas More denied the king's supremacy over the church. Because of this evidence, More was then found guilty of treason and was sentenced to death. And he continued to speak out. The standard sentence for a traitor was hanging, drawing, and quartering, but the king then commuted this to beheading, as he had been a friend and a loyal companion for so long, which was said to have been more straightforward and less horrific. On the 6th of July 1535, Sir Thomas More was led out of his prison cell inside the Tower of London and was guided up to Tower Hill on the short walk north of the tower by a number of guards. There were a huge number of witnesses, and the public flocked to see the execution of Sir Thomas More, Henry VIII's Lord Chancellor, and he was a man himself who had treated others brutally throughout his life, as he had beaten Protestants and treated them roughly. He wasn't the most liked by parts of the crowd, but it was noted that, about 9, he was brought out of the tower. His hair was long, his face pale and thin, and carrying a red cross in his hand. He often lifted his eyes to heaven, A woman meeting him with a cup of wine, he refused it, saying, Christ at his passion drank no wine, but gall and vinegar. Another woman came crying and demanded some papers she said she had left in his hands when he was Lord Chancellor, to whom he said, Good woman, have patience but for an hour. The king will rid me of the care I have for those papers and everything else. Another woman followed him crying he had done her much wrong when he was Lord Chancellor, to whom he said, I very well remember the cause, and, as I were to decide it now, I should make the same decree. When he came to the scaffold, it seemed ready to fall, whereupon he said merrily to the lieutenant, Pray sit, see me safe up, and as to my coming down, let me shift for myself. Being about to speak to the people, he was interrupted by the sheriff, and thereupon he only desired the people to pray for him and bear witness he died in the faith of the Catholic Church, a faithful servant to God and the king. And kneeling, he repeated the Miserere psalm with much devotion, and rising up, the executioner asked him for forgiveness. He kissed him and said, Pick up thy spirits, man, and be not afraid to do thine office. My neck is very short. Take heed, therefore, thou strike not array for having thine honesty. Laying his head upon the block, he bid the executioner stay till he had put his beard aside, for that he had committed no treason. Thus he suffered with much cheerfulness. His head was taken off at one blow and was placed upon London Bridge, where, having continued for some months and being thrown into the Thames to make room for others, his daughter Margaret brought it in, closed it in a leaden box, and kept it for a relic. However, this was not the end of the grisly demise of Sir Thomas More. As mentioned, his head was placed on a pike above London Bridge, but his body was taken back inside the walls of the Tower of London and was carried into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where it was interred inside of a crypt alongside many others who were executed on Tower Hill. His body would be joined by the remains of thousands. And today, the body of Sir Thomas More is interred inside of an out-of-bounds tomb within the crypt, which cannot be viewed by the public. However, what happened to More's head is remarkable and shocking. After it was taken to London Bridge, it was handed over to the Keeper of the Heads, the man who was responsible for maintaining the heads placed above the gatehouse of those who had been executed. These macabre exhibitions were intended to scare the people of London. But the head was dipped in tar and was placed 80 feet in the air. It was held there for around a month, with thousands passing under the head of Thomas More, and it was then replaced by one of his friends, Bishop John Fisher. But the head of More was not thrown into the River Thames as was customary. It's considered that his daughter, Margaret Roper, managed to bribe the Keeper of the Heads to knock the head of her father off the pike, and that she then managed to gather this and take it away with her for reburial. She embalmed the head of her father, covering it in spices, and she managed to preserve it rather well. For taking the head of her father, a man considered by Henry VIII a traitor, she could have been imprisoned or even executed herself. But when Margaret died in 1544, the head of her father, Sir Thomas More, was buried next to her in the same vault. However, in 1824, this vault was opened and the head of Sir Thomas More was taken out of it and shown to the public inside of St. Dunstan's Church in Canterbury. Many people continued to visit it, but there was some debate as to where the head of More actually was, as some said it had been actually buried inside of a tomb made for More inside of Chelsea Old Church. However, the majority of the evidence, which even includes eyewitness testimony, claims the head of Sir Thomas More was interred with his daughter. After a number of years it was placed back inside of the Roper vault, and it was even photographed by someone who looked at it through a grill and showed his daughter's lead casket, but the head of the man who had been considered one of the finest historians of the Tudor period. The demise of Sir Thomas More was shocking. He was for a long time a loyal member of King Henry VIII's government and staff, but he was a man of such strong morals and principles that he could not accept the changes that the king made to the nation. Because of this, he faced the ultimate punishment, and he would lose his head on the orders of his former friend, the infamous Tudor monarch, who in the years later would also order the execution of his second wife, Anne Boleyn, the very woman that More could not support, and she is buried close to the remains of More inside of the chapel of the Tower of London. Inside the Tower of London, during the reign of King Henry VIII, 2 of the Tudor monarch's wives were executed upon the scaffold on Tower Green. Anne Boleyn was the second wife of the king, and she was executed by sword. But Catherine Howard was the tragic 5th wife of the king, who was allegedly a teenager when she was executed by axe. Catherine had been sentenced to death for treason and adultery behind her husband's back. But one woman who was implicated in the whole Catherine Howard scandal was a woman who allegedly arranged for the Queen to have time and liaisons with her lover, the king's favourite courtier, Thomas Culpeper. But Jane Boleyn was the sister-in-law of the king's second wife, Anne Boleyn, and she has gone down in history as being a woman who was rather sinister, and she may have even sent her own husband to the block on Tower Hill. But her coffin was opened centuries after her execution, inside of the Tower of London's chapel. Jane Boleyn was born as Jane Parker, and she came from a rather noble family, and she was, through her great-grandmother, related very distantly to the King Henry VIII. She was his half-second cousin, and she was raised in Norfolk, and her family were well thought of, and she was then sent to the royal court to serve the King and the Queen. At the age of 14, Jane became a member of Catherine of Aragon's household, the king's first wife, and she was present when the royal entourage travelled to France for the Field of the Cloth of Gold, where the king and the French king met. Jane was, it's believed, attractive, and she was well liked at court as she got stuck into the entertainment and different masquerades that were held. But in 1525, she then got married to George Boleyn, who was the brother of Anne and Mary Boleyn, and he was the only Boleyn son. At this time, Anne Boleyn, George's sister, was not involved with Henry VIII, but she was present at the royal court, and Jane and George were gifted Grimston Manor in Norfolk by Henry VIII, and Jane became known from then on as the Viscountess Rochford. Jane received a number of gifts and items for her new home, which was renovated to a huge extent. However, her marriage was not the happiest, as George was known to have cheated on her many times, and he had a very wild lifestyle in which he slept with many, many women. He had a number of affairs, but when Anne Boleyn then married Henry VIII, Jane was the sister-in-law of the Queen, and she was the aunt to the future Queen Elizabeth I. And Jane and Anne did not get on at all. However, the Boleyns then fell from grace, and it was Henry VIII's frustrations with regards to Anne Boleyn being unable to give him the male heir that he greatly wanted, that led to the chaos which occurred with Anne Boleyn then later losing her head on Tower Green. But for Jane Boleyn, the largest effect of this was that her husband George was implicated in the charges alongside Anne. George was accused of sleeping with his sister and incest, and because of this he was executed on Tower Hill. Over the centuries it has emerged that Jane may have been involved in giving evidence against her own husband, but she was certainly a bitter woman. One historian claimed, with regards to this accusation, that Jane Rochford found herself dragged into a maelstrom of intrigue, innuendo and speculation, for when Cromwell sent for Jane, he already had much of what he needed, not only to bring down Anne and her circle, but to make possible the king's marriage to Jane Seymour. Faced with such relentlessness, incessant questions which she had no choice but to answer, Jane would have searched her memory for every tiny incident that occurred to her. Jane had not been quick to tell tales, but she had buckled under the pressure of relentless questioning, and it was her weakness under interrogation that gave her future detractors, happy to find a scapegoat to exonerate the king from the heinous charge of callously killing his innocent wife, the ammunition to maintain that it was her evidence that had fooled Henry and destroyed Anne and George. George Boleyn, Jane's husband, was executed on the 17th of May 1536, alongside a number of other men who were accused of sleeping with the Queen. However, Jane may have even witnessed her own husband's execution, or her sister-in-law Anne Boleyn's execution. She was greatly affected by this new change in position, as the lands which were owned by her husband due to his treason were forfeited, and they fell into the hands of the King of England, Henry VIII. Jane had to leave the court to secure her status and her finances, and she was then given a good pension, and she acted as a lady-in-waiting for Jane Seymour, and she was even given accommodation inside the royal palaces and other luxuries, including expensive luxury food. She helped the king get rid of his fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, and Jane testified that he and Anne of Cleves did not consummate their marriage. But Jane is mostly commonly remembered for her involvement with the king's fifth wife, the teenage Catherine Howard. Jane was clearly in favour with the king, and Henry VIII may have believed that she was a good influence on his young wife. And she was a senior lady-in-waiting for Catherine Howard. She had a lot of influence over the young girl, but later Catherine's past would come back to bite her, and as she had allegedly been involved with other men, and at this time this was considered not acceptable for the king's wife. But Jane then encouraged Catherine to strike up a relationship with the king's favourite courtier, Thomas Culpeper. He and Catherine were distant cousins, and when she was a lady-in-waiting for the previous queen, Catherine considered marrying Culpeper. And the pair had a lot in common, and more in fact than the young queen had with her husband Henry VIII. The pair met up in secret and had, it's believed, an affair which was physical, and much of these meetings were arranged and organised by Jane Boleyn. And she would be arrested, also along with the Queen, when the truth came out. Inside the Tower of London, Jane Boleyn was imprisoned and locked up, and she was interrogated, and it was said that she had a complete nervous breakdown, as she was, in 1542, declared insane, as she was prone to having fits of frenzy. But at the time, the king could not execute someone who was said to have been declared insane. But this wasn't a problem for Henry VIII, who changed the laws of his country to allow high treason to carry the same death penalty even for the insane. Jane was scheduled for her execution on the 13th of February 1542, and she would be executed straight after the woman she served, the Queen, Catherine Howard. She had been stripped of this title, and inside the Tower of London on the scaffold, Catherine's head was taken off in one swift blow. The scaffold was covered in hay, and Catherine had bled a lot, and Jane Boleyn was then brought out straight after for her own execution, and she then knelt in the blood of the former queen, the woman who she had helped to commit adultery, behind the king's back. In a long speech, Jane apologised for her sins, and she gave the executioner forgiveness, and she knelt on the block and rested her head on it. In one swing, the executioner took her head off too, and then Jane's body was taken inside the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, ready for burial. As Jane Boleyn was a noblewoman, we must consider a few different things. The king had given specific instructions for Catherine Howard to be covered in quicklime to dissolve and decay her remains quicker, but he probably did not order this for Jane, due to her status and the fact she was an aunt of the future Queen Elizabeth I. Jane may have been given an arrow chest or some form of coffin also, and may have been buried with more dignity than Catherine Howard. She was taken into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula next to the scaffold site for her burial, but the bones of Jane Boleyn were actually discovered and located centuries later. During the reign of Queen Victoria, the monarch ordered renovations to occur inside the Tower's chapel, as she believed it was somewhere which was not fit to house the burials of a number of queens. The floor in particular was very uneven, and because of this there were a number of exhumations ordered of those who had been buried in there. Amongst the bones found were those who belonged to Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, and Jane's sister-in-law. But other remains were found too of high-profile people. A committee gathered to help identify the remains of these people, and they deliberated on what they found. In the site close to where it was believed that Catherine Howard was buried, no remains of the fifth wife were located, except a small pile of bone which had been affected by the presence of lime. But the first bones located belonged to a woman who was dated to have been around 40 years old, and the committee reached the conclusion, due to the location of where Catherine Howard's remains should have been, as well as the evidence, that this was Jane Boleyn. This skeleton was clearly of a woman who had been executed using a sharp instrument, such as an axe, and it was stated that she was around 40 when she was executed, and because of this it was concluded that these were Jane Boleyn. They were found close to a second woman's bones, who was said to have been a woman of considerably advanced years who had been tall and above average height, and these remains were of Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, who was executed also during the reign of Henry VIII. It appears these two noble women were buried next to each other, or close to each other, out of respect for their position. Later, the remains of Jane Boleyn were removed whilst the renovation work took place, and they were put inside of a lead casket, and a small plaque marking who the bones belonged to was made on this. But she was then reinterred inside the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, close to the high altar near to Anne Boleyn's remains and also Margaret Pole. Her husband, George Boleyn, was also identified during this process, and she was buried close to him also. Jane's reputation in history is debated, as some believed she was a woman who told the authorities about her husband's actions that led to his execution, and these charges that he was accused of were ultimately false. But Jane's execution inside the Tower was also brutal, as she lost her head at the sharp blade of the executioner's axe, and centuries later her remains were dug up. Throughout the reign of King Henry VIII, the infamous Tudor monarch executed up to 70,000 people inside of his own kingdom, and this included 2 of his own wives, but those who were of the very noble status and birth were allowed what was regarded as a private execution away from the eyes of the general public inside the Tower of London. Truth be told, when these executions were carried out inside of the Tower, there would actually be hundreds of witnesses, some of whom even snuck into the fortress as the gates were regularly accidentally left open. But one woman, who's often forgotten about when compared with the 2 wives of the king who were condemned inside of the Tower, was a woman who had royal blood and who many regarded to have a legitimate claim to the English throne. Some classed Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, as someone who had a better claim to the throne than the king, Henry VIII, but Henry would dispatch her at the hands of a brutal executioner, who made a terrible job of the execution. But centuries later, the body of Margaret Pole was dug up and exhumed inside the Tower of London's chapel. What's the story of this? Margaret Pole was the daughter of George Plantagenet, the Duke of Clarence, who is considered one of the medieval period's biggest traitors. He stabbed his brother, Edward IV, in the back a number of times during the Wars of the Roses, and as George Plantagenet was the brother of the king, this then meant that Margaret possessed royal blood and equally a later claim to the English throne. She was one of only 2 women who during the Tudor period became a peeress in her own right without having a husband who claimed a title, and she was considered the last remaining member of the Plantagenet dynasty in the House of York, the sworn enemies of the Tudors. But following the Battle of Bosworth Field, the Tudors of course took the throne as Henry VII defeated Richard III, the uncle of Margaret. Margaret Pole was the cousin of the new Queen Elizabeth of York, and Margaret was cared for by the new King and Queen. She was then married off to Sir Richard Pole, Henry VII's cousin, and he was a key player in the King's government. But she then also became close with Catherine of Aragon, who was married to the heir, at the time, Arthur Tudor. But Richard Pole died in 1505, leaving Margaret a widow with 5 children, and she did not know where to turn, and she was forced to live inside of Sion Abbey with the nuns. But she came to prominence during the reign of Henry VIII. When Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon, Margaret became one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, and she was restored to some of her brother's lands, and she was known as the Countess of Salisbury. As a landowner, Margaret was rather skilled and she was very well thought of. She promoted learning and her sons also did well. But Margaret even had land disputes with Henry VIII and came off rather well from them. She was the governess of the king's eldest daughter Mary, the future Mary I, and she was close with her. However, one of the biggest issues for Margaret Pole was that her son dissented against the king. Reginald Pole was later accepted as a cardinal for Rome, and he was a massive enemy of Henry VIII. He began to plot to provoke an invasion of England following Henry's changes to the church in England, and the king learned of this, and he was furious. Margaret also angered the king as she refused to hand Mary I's jewels back, and the king said that she was a fool, and then as Reginald Pole continued to rise through the Catholic Church's ranks, He then continued to speak out against Henry and Anne Boleyn, his second wife. But the king, Henry VIII, threatened Pole and said that if a cardinal's hat ever arrived on English soil for them, he would not have a head to wear it on. But Reginald Pole was made a cardinal in 1537, and the Pope then put him in charge of organising resistance and then colluding with the Pilgrimage of Grace, the uprising that took place in the north of England. This rebellion was the most serious during Henry VIII's reign, and it focused on the dissolution of the monasteries and Cromwell and the king's changes to the church that brought misery to many and made many monks and religious people homeless. But following this, there was a huge amount of bloodshed as the king executed many, and Geoffrey Pole, Margaret's son, was arrested in 1538, and then Margaret Pole was arrested at the age of 65 and was then accused of treason and was sent to the Tower of London. She lost all of her lands and her titles, and it was claimed that during interrogation that Cromwell had located in her home a tunic which carried the 5 wounds of Christ, and Margaret was then accused of underground illegal Catholic worship. But this was apparently found 6 months after her arrest, meaning it was therefore planted as false evidence, and Cromwell had produced this himself, but it was used as a way to sentence Margaret Pole, the elderly countess, to death. She was not given an execution date, and she was to be executed whenever Henry VIII wished, and this meant that every day she awoke inside of the tower, not knowing if it would be her last. She was kept under lock and key for 2.5 years inside of the tower. She was given some servants and some clothing inside of the tower, and she carved inside the wall of her cell that, "For traitors on the block shall die. I am no traitor, no, not I. My faithfulness stands fast, and so towards the block I shall not go, nor make one step, as you shall see. Christ, in thy mercy, save thou me." Then, on the morning of the 27th of May, 1541, Margaret Pole was told she was going to be executed within the next hour, and she said she had not committed any crimes, but the king had ordered her execution. It was quickly planned, and no scaffold was available for her execution. She was dragged from her prison cell to where a wooden block had been placed on the ground, and she was then approached by an axeman, but not the normal executioner who performed executions inside the tower or on Tower Hill. He was armed with his weapon, and there are differing accounts of her execution. The main executioner had been sent north to deal with the executions following the Pilgrimage of Grace, but the man who executed Margaret, it was said to have been a wretched and blundering youth who literally hacked her head and shoulders to pieces in the most pitiful manner. The account stated that it took roughly 10 swings of the axe to perform her execution and to take Margaret Pole's head from her shoulders. Another claimed that after the first blow from the axe that Margaret left up from the block and tried to run around the courtyard, and then 11 swings of the axe were needed to behead her. But following her execution, the remains of the elderly Margaret Pole were collected, and they were then taken to the nearby chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the tower's walls. But during the reign of Queen Victoria, the monarch visited the chapel and said that the repair work was needed, as it was not fit enough of a place to house the remains of queens. The floor in particular was a mess, and it needed lifting. Specialists and archaeologists were brought in, and inside of the chapel, the remains of many of those people who lost their lives inside the Tower of London during the Tudor period and later, and also those who were executed on Tower Hill, were discovered. Queen Anne Boleyn's body was located and identified by the royal physician and doctor, and a committee was gathered to analyse the remains of those who were discovered to try and identify them. With Margaret Pole, the committee were looking for something quite particular, an elderly woman of the 16th century who had lost her head through execution by a sharp instrument such as an axe. The first woman's bones that were found under the floor were of a woman of 40 years old, and the committee settled that these belonged to Jane Boleyn, or Lady Rochford, the sister-in-law of Anne Boleyn and the wife of George Boleyn. But she had been executed inside the Tower of London by axe. Close by to the remains of Lady Rochford were found the full skeletal remains of a woman who was described of considerably advanced years, who had been tall and certainly of above average height. The committee analysed these remains, and this elderly woman had clearly been executed by decapitation using a sharp instrument. And there was only one woman who fitted the bill for this, and that was Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury. She was 67 when she was executed, and during the Tudor period was said to have been very old by the standards of the day, and it was also known that she was a rather tall lady. Her remains were then gathered and were then placed inside of an individual leaden box or a small coffin. On top of this, a small engraving outlined whose remains were inside, and this coffin were then moved to a number of months to the Queen's house opposite the chapel. After the work had been completed, the remains of Margaret Pole were then reburied back inside the chapel close to the high altar. She was interred in front of the altar, on the plot closest to the wall next to Jane Boleyn. But let's remember, she was a woman who lost her head in one of the most brutal and barbaric ways possible. And she was a victim of the most notorious king that England had ever seen. She was a woman who had royal blood, being the daughter of the brother of Edward IV, and she had, in the eyes of some, a better claim to the English crown than the man who condemned her. The 22nd of January 1552 on Tower Hill, one of the most important and influential Tudor politicians was led out to his execution scaffold. He was taken out of the Tower of London and was escorted by guards to Tower Hill, where the crowds flocked to see his demise. Edward Seymour was the uncle to King Edward VI, and he was also the Lord Protector, who had been entrusted to practically govern England, whilst the king was too young to rule himself. But Edward Seymour found himself forced out of power and was imprisoned, as John Dudley, the Earl of Warwick, and other prominent members of the king's government convinced the king to sentence him to death. However, in the years following his execution, Edward Seymour had his body exhumed from its place of burial inside the Tower of London's chapel, and what was discovered was remarkable. Edward Seymour was a very important member of the King's Council during the reign of King Henry VIII. He was the brother of Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, who died following giving birth to the future King Edward VI. Seymour was made the Warden of the Scottish Marshes and the Lord High Admiral, and he was a man who was tasked with bringing Scotland to heel, and he would cause chaos during the War of the Rough Wooing, as the English forces pillaged Edinburgh and burned down many different villages and settlements on their way to the Scottish capital. He remained in power throughout Henry's reign, and he was a skilled military commander and was a man greatly trusted by the sixth wife Tudor king. He attended on the king in his final moments, but upon the death of Henry VIII, Seymour was then appointed one of the 16 executors who were to act as Edward VI's counsel until he got to the age of 18. But Edward Seymour was then appointed as the Lord Protector, and despite the king's will not saying that this was necessary, he took control of Edward VI's Regency Council, and he was the most powerful man across England. Whatever he said practically went, and he took over power rather quickly, and he repealed all the heresy laws and treason laws passed across England since the reign of Edward III. He then also tried to win over the Scots, but further battles broke out. But one of the most serious issues he had to deal with was his brother. Thomas Seymour was a jealous, power-hungry man who wanted his brother's influence, and he even married Henry VIII's widow, Catherine Parr, shortly after the king's death. And with this, Thomas Seymour then plotted to even marry Princess Elizabeth at one point. But he would find himself executed as he made a plan to abduct the young king, Edward VI, and it was Edward Seymour who signed his own brother's death warrant, as Thomas Seymour was executed on Tower Hill on the 20th of March 1549. But across England there were many rebellions, and in 1549 armed revolts occurred, and this was caused by many of the religious changes made by the government. There was a significant number of uprisings which were also focused around changes to land, and these events were rather troubling for Edward Seymour, as he was seen as the figurehead of the government, which was a failing government. It was stated in a letter to him that, Every man of the council has misliked your proceedings. Would to God that at the first stir you had followed the matter hotly, and caused justice to be misinterpreted in solemn fashion to the terror of others. But his removal from power would come in the form of a coup, and Seymour knew he faced a threat to his rule. He requested troops to protect him, but his removal from power was led by John Dudley, the Earl of Warwick. He became the leader of the council, and the councillors convinced the king, Edward VI, that Seymour was making the nation poorly and that he was guilty of ambition, vainglory, entering into rash wars in mine youth, negligent looking of New Haven, enriching himself of my treasure, following his own opinion, and doing all by his own authority. For his troubles, Edward Seymour then found himself locked up inside of the Tower of London, and he was sentenced to death by an act of attainder. He wrote whilst inside of the Tower that, "Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Put thy trust in the Lord with all things heart." And he then wrote, "From the Tower, the death before my death." On the morning of the 22nd of January 1552, Edward Seymour was taken from his prison cell in the Tower of London at 8 a.m. and was escorted on the short walk north to Tower Hill and the public beheading spot. It was here where many Tudor figures, such as Thomas Cromwell and Sir Thomas More, were executed, and awaiting him was an executioner armed with an axe. As he was led up the steps of the scaffold, he turned to the crowd and prayed to them, and he did make a speech saying he had been sentenced to death by law, and that he accepted the actions of the King and Regency Council, but he did think that he had caused no offence or committed no crime, and he said in his final moments he was close with God, and that he was glad he had been given time to pray. But then a huge rush occurred, and some believed that it was Seymour's pardon from the king, but the reality was that a group of guards rushed forwards to see the execution themselves. He then signed off by saying, "For all be it, the spirit be willing and ready. The flesh is frail and wavering, and through your quietness I shall be much more quieter." He quietly spoke with the executioner and prayed for a quick execution consisting of one blow from the axe, and he read a final confession before he gave a number of gold rings to the executioner. But Edward Seymour then took off his gown and laid his head on the block, and the executioner united the strings of his shirt collar, and he was given a handkerchief to tie around his eyes. His final words were, "O Lord Jesus, preserve me." And the executioner then struck his axe down towards Seymour's neck, and in one swift blow the head of the former Lord Protector was then taken off. But this was not the end of his story. His body and his head were collected, and were then placed on a cart to be taken back into the Tower of London's chapel for burial. A short burial ceremony took place for the former Lord Protector, and because of his status he was buried close to the altar, near to the remains of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, two of Henry VIII's wives, and women that Edward Seymour had known. However, during the reign of Queen Victoria, the church that he had been buried in had fallen into a state of disrepair, and when the monarch visited, she claimed that it was no place for a burial of one queen, let alone three, who were buried inside of the walls. In particular, one of the big problems was at the floor, and to conduct this work the builders needed to lift the path, and they knew as they were near the altar that they would come across the bodies of some of the Tudor period's most infamous figures. A committee was gathered to help identify the bodies of those who were discovered, and the remains of Anne Boleyn were found, and the royal doctor confirmed these. But the remains of Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector, were then discovered. Close to the remains of Anne Boleyn were found the bones of two men. It was stated that there were two dukes who were buried between two queens. Queen Victoria's doctor, Frederick Mowat, confirmed that one of the skeletons belonged to a tall and broad man who was roughly 50 years old when he died. He confirmed that he had died through beheading and decapitation with a sharp instrument, such as an axe, crashing down on his neck. The committee and the doctor came to the conclusion that this was in fact Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, and Edward VI, Lord Protector. Interestingly, the other man's remains were said to have been attributed to the Earl of Warwick, John Dudley, the very man who was the mastermind behind the fall from grace of Edward Seymour, and these two enemies had been laid to rest next to each other. The remains were then gathered inside of a new lead coffin, and on this was a small plate that stated that the remains and bones belonged to Edward Seymour. Months later, the remains were returned to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula inside the Tower of London. A number of men witnessed the reburials, which included Anne Boleyn's remains being returned below the high altar. He was buried next to Queen Anne Boleyn and the Earl of Warwick, John Dudley, or the Duke of Northumberland, as he was also known. He was buried on the first row of burials behind the Duke of Monmouth. Edward Seymour is seen as a controversial figure during the Tudor period. He was practically ruling as a king and would during the early part of Edward VI's reign, and he made a number of huge changes to religion and was seen as a skilled military commander. He was trusted by Henry VIII, but then he fell from grace, as a number of other dukes and earls dug their claws into his unpopular reputation, and with this he was executed on Tower Hill. But his remains were then dug up and exhumed centuries after his death. On the 22nd of August, 1553, one of the most powerful men in England was led to the execution scaffold on Tower Hill. He was there to meet the axeman and executioner, who was there to take his head clean off with the axe. John Dudley was the first Duke of Northumberland, and following the downfall of Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector, John Dudley emerged as the de facto regent and ruler for England during the reign of King Henry VIII's young son, Edward VI. Dudley was a very powerful man, and he oversaw a turbulent time in England as, following the death of young Edward VI, there was a dispute for the throne, as Dudley's daughter-in-law, Lady Jane Grey, was made queen. Dudley was a master manipulator, and someone who positioned himself as the main power behind the throne. But when Mary I, or Bloody Mary, came onto the throne following Jane's 9 days as queen, she dealt with Dudley ruthlessly. But after his execution, the body of Dudley was laid to rest inside the Tower of London's small chapel, but it was then dug up and was exhumed. John Dudley was a powerful politician and a soldier, who, as mentioned, practically ruled England between the years 1549 and 1554. It had been agreed that he was a schemer and a plotter who was obsessed with power, and he wanted more and more influence and power over the crown. Dudley's father was a man who was executed by King Henry VIII, and John Dudley became the deputy governor of the English port of Calais, and he was a skilled soldier and military leader in France, and was later appointed the Lord High Admiral. He was then part of Edward Seymour's invasion of Scotland, which rampaged north of the border, and he was also then made the Earl of Warwick in 1546. However, following the death of King Henry VIII, Warwick was appointed to become a member of the Regency Council that would help govern and rule England during the youth of Edward VI. The council was to rule whilst the king was too young to do so, and whilst he was a child, the man who was in charge of this was Edward Seymour. He ruled as the protector, and to begin with, he and Dudley worked together, and John Dudley's skilled military leadership was responsible for much of Edward Seymour's victories in Scotland. However, there was a lot of unrest in England during this time, and the Earl of Warwick, Dudley, took advantage of this, and he planned then to depose Seymour, and he managed to imprison him. The pair did briefly reconcile. However, John Dudley, the Earl of Warwick, then began the head of the government, and he was now the de facto ruler of England whilst Edward VI was young. He managed to replace Seymour as the leader of the government and made a number of changes. He left Scotland, reversed a lot of what Seymour had done, and continued to consolidate the Protestant Reformation, and also seized a lot of wealth from the church. However, to give him more power, John Dudley then made himself Duke of Northumberland, and then arrested Seymour again, and persuaded the king, Edward VI, to sanction his execution. With Seymour out of the way, he continued to bring in a number of policies, and some of these were positive, as he tried to legitimise coinage and also tried to fight inflation across the nation. But when Edward VI died from tuberculosis at the age of 15, John Dudley carried out his plan. He had worked on the young king who had named Lady Jane Grey his successor, and as a matter of fact, Jane was actually Dudley's daughter-in-law, as she was married to Guildford, John's son. Lady Jane Grey is remembered as the 9-day queen, for the fact she ruled for 9 days and accepted the crown before she was deposed by Mary I, the eldest child of King Henry VIII. It was John Dudley who proclaimed Jane the Queen of England, but the Privy Council switched their support to Mary, and with this Jane was imprisoned inside the Tower of London. Dudley also found himself locked up inside the Tower, accused of treason, and he was tried on the 18th of August 1553 inside of Westminster Hall. His former colleagues acted as the judge and jury, and Dudley believed he had acted in the best interests of the king and by the warrant of the Great Seal, but he was found guilty of treason and was then sentenced to death. He tried to appeal to Queen Mary I to overturn his death sentence, as he had 5 sons, but she would not relent. He was left to rot inside the Tower of London and was visited by senior government officials, and his execution was then planned for the 21st of August 1553 at 8 o'clock in the morning, but it was then cancelled. With this, Dudley was then taken to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula inside the tower's walls, and he took Catholic communion, and he said that the leagues that is upon the realm and upon us now is that we have erred from the faith these 16 years. But that evening Dudley learnt that he must prepare myself against tomorrow to receive my deadly stroke, and he wrote, "O my good Lord, remember how sweet life is, and how bitter ye country." On the 22nd of August 1553, John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, was brought to Tower Hill for his execution. A crowd of 10,000 people had gathered to witness the proceedings, and on the scaffold it was said Dudley confessed to his crimes. It was said of his execution that, "And yet this act whereof I die was not altogether of me, as it is thought, but I was procured and induced thereunto by others. I was, I say, induced thereunto by others, howbeit God forbid that I should name any man unto you. I will name no man unto you, and therefore I beseech you not look for it. And one thing more, good people, I have to say unto you, and that is to warn you and exhort you to beware of these seditious preachers and teachers of new doctrine, which pretend to preach God's word, but in very deed they preach their own fancies. They know not today what they would have tomorrow. They open the book, but they cannot shut it again. I could, good people, rehearse much more, but you know I have another thing to do, whereunto I must prepare me, for the time draweth away." And after he had thus spoken, he kneeled down, and, bowing towards the block, he said, "I have deserved 1,000 deaths," and thereupon he made a cross upon the straw, and kissed it, and laid his head upon the block, and so died. The executioner took his head clean off with the axe, and following this, Dudley's remains were taken into the Tower of London, and he was buried inside the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. But during the reign of Queen Victoria, the church underwent a significant amount of repairs. When Victoria visited the tower, she deemed the chapel to have been not good enough to house the remains of 3 queens, because of the state of decay and disrepair it was in. The floor was uneven and broken in places, and the renovation work was to take place, but to carry out the sufficient repair work, the Tower of London's chapel floor was removed, and when this was carried out, a number of significant remains were found. The body of Henry VIII's second wife, Anne Boleyn, was found, and it was known that Northumberland's remains were nearby, and a committee was then gathered to search for these and identify them. It was known that Queen Anne Boleyn's remains were buried close to the remains of 2 men, and it was said that 2 dukes were buried between 2 queens. The body of 1 man was found, and it belonged to a tall and broad man of around 50 years of age, and the committee concluded that this man, who lost his head by sharp axe or weapon, was Edward Seymour, the rival of John Dudley. But next to this, the body of another man was found, and these remains, it was said, belonged to a large man about 6 feet in height and aged around 50 years, and in particular it was noted that this man had a rather large skull. The committee then came to the conclusion that these remains were those belonging to John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland. His body and skeletal remains were then collected and were placed inside a new lead coffin and container. The name of Dudley was etched onto this, and months after his remains were exhumed, they were then reburied inside the Tower's chapel. John Dudley was the Duke of Northumberland, who is remembered as being a schemer and a manipulator who took control of England whilst Edward VI was just a young boy. He was supposed to be helping to rule, but he made a number of significant changes to the nation. Dudley, however, was someone who flew too close to the sun, and his involvement in placing his daughter-in-law as the Queen of England led to his downfall, one that would result in the loss of his head in front of a crowd of 10,000, as an axeman performed the job of his execution. On the 25th of February 1601, on Tower Green, inside of London, inside the Tower of London, a former favourite of Queen Elizabeth I, the last Tudor queen, was led upwards towards the execution scaffold for his death. Waiting for him was an axeman who was ready to take his head from his shoulders. Robert Devereux was the second Earl of Essex, and he was sentenced to death for treason, and he was someone who was linked to rebellion. He was a man who was jealous, but he captured the imagination of the Queen, and some believed he may have even been a man linked to marriage with the Queen, Elizabeth I. But following his execution, Robert Devereux was interred and buried inside of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, inside the Tower of London's walls. However, this was not the end of his story. Centuries later, his body was dug up and was exhumed from its grave, and what those people who did this found was remarkable. Robert Devereux was a cousin of Queen Elizabeth I, and at the age of 9 he succeeded to his father's title and became the second Earl of Essex. As a young man, he was seen as a skilled soldier, and he fought in the Spanish Netherlands, and when he returned to England, he was made the Master of the Horse by Elizabeth I, but he at times could anger the Queen. But he always managed to gain her favour again if he had ever annoyed her. Some at the time thought that he would be a possible husband to Elizabeth I, as they would stay up late playing cards, but he also married Frances Walsingham in secret. This was not ideal, as the Queen would not be happy when she found out about this. He stayed inside of England after a number of foreign adventures, and he then even helped to foil an alleged plot against the Queen's life by a physician inside of her court, Rodrigo Lopez. He tried to challenge the authority of the Cecil family and defied the Queen's authority when he pursued a Spanish treasure fleet, and also when the Third Spanish Armada appeared off the English coast in October 1597. The coast was undefended and there was a significant amount of chaos and panic. But Devereux fell further from favour in the eyes of Queen Elizabeth when he took the job as the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. He was sent to deal with the rebellious Irish chieftains, and he led a huge force to Ireland. 16,000 soldiers to end the rebellion. He said he would confront them head-on. However, he fought a series of pointless battles and wasted money, and he also entered a truce with one of the rebels, which was seen as a humiliation for the English. And the Queen was furious with this. When he returned, the Queen had banned him ever coming back to court, and he then burst into her bedchamber in the morning at Nonsuch Palace, whilst the Queen was getting dressed, which then caused chaos. He was then ordered to stand in front of an interrogation regarding his dereliction of duty in Ireland, and he was held under house arrest at this time whilst the investigations occurred into what had actually happened in Ireland. Essex was tried in front of 18 men, and he was convicted and was deprived of his public office. However, he then, after achieving freedom, was involved in rebellion, and this was known as Essex's rebellion after him. He began to fortify Essex House and rally supporters, and he turned in his opinion of the Queen. He, on the 8th of February 1601, marched out of Essex House and he entered the city of London to try and gain an audience with the Queen, but he was proclaimed a traitor by Cecil, and his men tried to get through a barrier, and this was a skirmish. But Devereux then surrendered after he was besieged inside of Essex House. He was then, in the February of 1601, tried in front of peers for treason. It was stated of this that The indictment charged Essex with conspiring and imagining at London to depose and slay the Queen and to subvert the government. It also stated that Essex had endeavoured to raise himself to the crown of England and usurp the royal dignity, and that in order to fulfil these intentions he and others rose and assembled themselves in open rebellion, and moved and persuaded many of the citizens of London to join them in their treason, and endeavoured to get the city of London into their possession and power, and wounded and killed many of the Queen's subjects then and there assembled for the purpose of quelling such rebellion. Essex was charged also with holding the Lord Keeper and the other privy councillors in custody for 4 hours and more. He also claimed that the Infanta of Spain had a right to the crown of England, which was a terrible thing, and he was then found guilty of treason, and on the 25th of February 1601 his execution was carried out. He was allowed an execution inside the Tower of London, as he was of such noble standing. He was to be executed by beheading, and he did not get the standard sentence of hanging, drawing, and quartering, and he was brought by 16 guards from his rooms inside the Tower of London to the execution scaffold. His execution was not very clean. The executioner that day was Thomas Derrick, who listened to Devereux's speech on the scaffold, and he admitted his treason, and he said he never wanted to hurt the Queen. He bade farewell and hoped the Queen would get a long reign, but when Devereux placed his head on the block, the executioner stood there with his sharp axe, and he then struck the weapon on Devereux's head, but it did not come off with one blow. And then it took a second swing to do this, but still his head did not come off. Finally, a third swing of the axe took Devereux's head clean away. Following his execution, his remains were then collected, and Devereux was taken into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula next to the Tower Green. His body was lowered into a grave, which was then covered over, and he was buried close to where 2 of Henry VIII's wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, were interred. But over the next few centuries, the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula inside the tower fell into a terrible state of disrepair and decay. During the reign of Queen Victoria, the Queen visited the tower and ordered renovations of the chapel to make sure the resting place of the Tudor queens was well respected and was in good condition. Because of this, the floor, which had lifted and was uneven, was lifted, and the chapel and a committee of people were brought in to identify the bodies of those men and women who were found. The bodies of some of the most prominent executed Tudor figures were found, and this included the remains of Queen Anne Boleyn. But amongst the bodies found were the remains of Robert Devereux. The committee that gathered inspected the remains, and they confirmed that they belonged to a man in his 30s who lost his life by decapitation and beheading by a sword or an axe. With this, they came to the conclusion that this body belonged to the executed former favourite of Elizabeth I. His remains were then placed inside of a new lead casket, and a plate was placed on this to show who the bones belonged to, and these were then placed inside of the Queen's house opposite the chapel before they were then reburied close to the altar along with some of the most prominent executed Tudor people. Devereux was interred in the second row below the altar, and was interred second in on the right between the murdered poet Sir Thomas Overbury and the executed Earl of Arundel. He was buried behind Lady Rochford, Jane Boleyn, who lost her life alongside Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's 5th wife. Robert Devereux was a former favourite of Queen Elizabeth I, and he was someone who also caused the Queen a significant amount of stress and turmoil. He made a number of significant issues inside of Ireland, and later, because of him being ostracised, he tried to rebel to catch the Queen's attention. But for this he was sent to the executioner's scaffold inside the Tower of London. He was then buried in the chapel there, and his remains were then dug up centuries later.